Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called What's a Hot Drop?, written by Aware Material 507. Cartak was not having a good day, nor were any of his fellow soldiers. As the newest round of enemy bombardment began, screeching through the skies, as Cartak quickly braced himself against the trench walls before the blast rocked him back. The Barentu Republic, Cartak's home nation, had been declared war upon by the dastardly and barbaric Ortal Hive, and so Cartak was stuck sitting in a trench waiting to die. The war had been going on for nearly a year now, and he had been one of the millions of soldiers who had been smart and hardy enough to survive in this hellhole, but dumb enough to still have signed up. Cartak shuddered as an artillery shell detonated close to the section of trench he had been assigned to. Cartak and his people were four-limbed amphibians, not too dissimilar to the turtles of Earth according to humanity, their closest intergalactic neighbor other than the Ortal. With their large oval-shaped shells encompassing their entirety of their torso, Cartak was begrudgingly inclined to agree. Not that my shell is going to keep me safe against an artillery round or a well-placed plasma shot, Cartak thought grimly. Cartak was quickly snapped out of his thoughts as he realized that the bombardment had paused, which is not a good thing, as one might expect. This was because the only time the insectoid Ortal paused their bombardment was when they had decided to send their newest fresh wave of warriors. Cartak would know. He survived the last two. A fellow Barentu to Cartak's right seemed to be confused as all the veterans near them began grabbing their weapons and preparing to open fire across no man's land. Must have been one of the fresh replacements from the last troop transport. Hope they last longer than the last batch. The next transport won't be coming for a month or two, Cartak mused. A few of the more mindful veterans spared some time to shove the last of the newer reinforcements who did not take the hint into place with their weapons at the ready. Not long after they did, the Ortal Battlecry sounded out all across the miles-long trench, and hundreds of thousands of enemy insectoid warriors rushed out of the muddy holes they called trenches. Cartak hefted their plasma rifle and aimed down the sight in preparation of the order to open fire. And as the first of the Ortal Hive drones entered firing range, Cartak heard the order given by his sergeant and promptly began spraying plasma downrange, with those all around doing the same. The first few ranks of the enemy warriors were cut down immediately, only to be trampled over by the next two, and the next, and the next. Cartak continued to fire frantically as the enemy warriors quickly closed the distance between them and the trenches, which kept Cartak safe. As Cartak fought, he barely heard a radio operator behind him shout out that reinforcements were on the way, which baffled Cartak. No reinforcements would ever reach us in time to provide any kind of support before we were all killed. After all, it would take over an hour for those fresh reinforcements, whoever they are, to reach us from the landing site, thought Cartak. Any reasonable transport pilot would never dare to fly down to anything remotely close to an active battle. Thousands of soldiers are held in each transport, so if even one of them goes down, entire battalions are lost with it, so transports are always landed far behind the front lines, where they have no chance of being damaged or even fired upon. With all that in mind, Cartak simply dismissed the radio controller's words as empty encouragement from high command to keep our morale marginally higher, so that we would fight just a little longer and inflict a couple more casualties to the enemy before we all die. However, before Cartak could refocus his rifle back on the enemy, a loud, almost deafening whistle sound was blasted across the battlefield, something which Cartak and his fellow veteran troopers initially thought was the sound of friendly artillery that was going to rain down on top of them. High Command must have ordered for a collapsing defense. Can't say I blame them. At least we'll be taking a few of these damn bugs with us. Despite the incoming shells likely being the end of them, Cartak and his fellow veterans continued firing into the incoming enemy swarm, determined to take down as many of their enemies as they could before succumbing to the swarm. As the waves of chitinous Ortal warriors charged the trenches, the Berentu soldiers continued to pour fire into their ranks. However, it was beginning to look grim as more and more of the trenches' guns were being silenced one by one. That was until one of the fresh recruits near Cartak pointed up to the sky and yelled, "Look, it's reinforcements!" Cartak and a few of his fellow troopers looked up to the skies with disbelief as a formation of 3 angular-looking atmospheric craft rocketed towards their position before dropping a long line of odd, smaller devices into ortal formation. Before Cartak or any of his fellow soldiers could react, those small devices detonated, taking out swaths of ortal swarm, causing confusion and chaos within their lines. Something Cartak and his fellow soldiers took advantage of as soon as they broke free of the shock as well. As the Berentu soldiers opened fire on the panicking Ortal warriors and took back sections of their trenches, which had fallen into enemy hands, Cartak watched a further half-dozen craft drop down from the sky. Despite the familiar-looking boxy construction denoting a troop transport, each was 20 times smaller than any transport that he'd seen before. These transports rushed down to the surface at startling speeds before slowing down and flying over Ortal defensive trenches. As these transports flew, racks of missiles stuck out of the sides of their hull before rapidly expelling deadly projectiles, while the ball-mounted point defense turrets spewed out thousands of tiny projectiles. These munitions slammed into the Ortal masses and cut down large chunks of the now routing warriors. This level of fire support was about what you would expect from, say, a decently armed tank. However, the suddenness at which they arrived and the speed it moved across the battlefield was astounding, as it was deadly. One of the transports broke out of the formation before flying over Cartak's section of trench, where it touched down and disgorged 2 full squads of strange, rather thin bipedal soldiers, fully encased in dark reflective armor, carrying thin metal rifles, which Cartak was easily able to figure out were ballistic weapons. Cartak watched as the nearly 24 heavily armed and armored soldiers quickly fanned out across the area, taking up firing positions as 2 more bipedal forms emerged from what Cartak would learn was a rapid assault dropship. Out of the last 2 soldiers to emerge from the ship, Cartak guessed that one was an officer, given their slightly more ornamented uniform than those of the previous 2 squads, and that the other was some sort of communication specialist, given the large piece of communications equipment strapped to their back, which sported a few antennae. Cartak was somewhat surprised that the Vox operator could even carry such a large device, as it looked like it was about twice the height of a standard Berentu field kit. The officer quickly surveyed the battlefield, which at this point was a field with Ortal corpses, before snapping their head toward my sergeant, before speaking to some kind of gibberish through their helmet. After a few moments of awkward silence, a synthetic sounded voice rang out in our native language, stating that the officer wished to be brought to our commanding officer. As my sergeant led their officer and Vox operator towards the direction of our current commander, a lieutenant which had been field promoted after the last one led a suicidal charge into no man's land, the 2 squads of soldiers dropped into the trench Cartak and his squad was holding. The no longer quite fresh rookie to Cartak's right muttered, "Humans, huh? They sure know how to make an entrance. Who the hell would think to send transports right in the middle of an active battle?" One of the humans seemed to have heard what the trooper said, as they turned their helmeted head and spoke through their helmet's translator. "Who would stop straight into battle? The devil dogs, of course. Hurrah!" The human said as the last word, and the rest of his squad quickly repeated the utterance in unison. "If you think we're crazy, you should see the orbital drop shock troopers. Then you'll really look crazy." Rapid deployment into combat zone. What a strange idea. Cartak, however, was unable to consider the implications of someone more crazy than the troopers standing before them, as the Ortal warriors seemed to have reorganized themselves and were preparing to charge the lines once again. Looking over to the humans, Cartak asked, "Is there any chance those really fast strike craft will be able to take care of this wave as well?" "Oh no, those birds are heading back to orbit and rearming and reassignment. Plus, we can't have them steal all the fun now, could we?" The human said, more to his fellow soldiers than to us. before they and their fellows stepped up onto the trenches and aimed their weapons towards the forming mass of Ortal warriors. Cartak was briefly baffled as to the idea that they would rather fight the horde themselves rather than call another airstrike before the Ortal warriors let out their battle cry and began charging once again. Cartak quickly arrayed himself against the trench walls along with the humans and immediately began charging up the plasma rifle in preparation for when the enemy would enter optimal ranges. That was until the humans began firing their loud ballistic weapons, with a series of loud cracks which quickly cut down the first rank of warriors. The humans' bullets slammed through the Ortal soldiers' carapaces like they were made of glass, whilst maintaining enough momentum to crack through the other side. Confused for a few moments at the surprising range of the human weapons and the devastation they caused, Cartak almost did not realize the Ortal were within range before he began unleashing a few rounds of plasma of his own. As Cartak was unleashing their fire, all of the humans stopped firing before pulling out smaller plastic containers from their weapons before swiftly replacing them with fresh ones. Cartak did not have time to ponder this, as his weapon was quickly beginning to overheat before finally reaching critical levels and automatically venting heat in a desperate attempt to cool down. As his fellow Barentu soldiers' weapons did likewise, Cartak prepared himself to engage the Ortal in close-range combat, before the human weapons began to ring out once again, quickly pushing back the Ortal mass before the humans needed to replace those plastic containers. Looking down to his weapon, Cartak quickly realized that his rifle had nearly completed its cooldown sequence and was now ready for operation, which he quickly began to make use of. While the humans reloaded their weapons, Cartak and his fellow Barentu held the Ortal back for as long as they could, so that the humans could push them back before the cycle would repeat. At some point, Cartak's sergeant returned with the humans' officer, both of which quickly began adding their fire to the chorus of bullets and plasma pulses. Ortal corpses quickly piled up in the dozens before they began to retreat in earnest, which was quickly followed by a human officer making an absurd order. "All right, boys, fix bayonets and advance. We got them on the run. It's time to squash these bugs." Cartak and his fellow Barentu looked around in confusion as the humans did as ordered, before climbing out of the trenches and chasing after the fleeing Ortal. Looking around at his fellow soldiers, and more importantly, their sergeant, Cartak quickly glanced back at the humans before following their example and climbing after them. He was soon followed by his fellow soldiers, as all over the trench, similar events occurred, with the humans quickly countercharging the routing Ortal warriors, with Barentu soldiers right on their heels. Plasma pulses shot all around from both sides, with cracks of human rifles adding to the chaos, as the Ortal warriors were swiftly cut down in the hundreds. As the smoke cleared and soldiers returned back to the normal after the sudden influx of naturally made battle chemicals wore off, the humans and Barentu forces had caused the entire Ortal invasion in the region to fall back. This allowed for the complete conquest of the Ortal defense trench network and subsequent tunnel systems, which would prove deadly as humans and Barentu squads were sent to attack surrounding trench lines from behind, causing additional successful attacks from the rest of the front line. After the major push and subsequent attacks on the rest of the trench network, Cartak and the rest of his battalion were shipped back for R&R, along with their now permanent human attachment. During the time off of the front, Cartak managed to ask the same human who had jumped into his trench just a few weeks ago, "Why would you or anyone else ever sign up to be shock trooper, as you say? Would it not be more preferable to land in a safe location rather than have the chance of going up in flames in the atmosphere during the descent?" The human, who I would learn was named Leroy, pondered for a second before answering with something Cartak would be forever confused by until the end of his days. "Why, it's faster, of course. What kind of devil dog would I be if I didn't want to get stuck in and fight the good fight?" End of story. I would like to thank our T5 members and patrons, Casper Arnholtz, John Creighton, Vidmori, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.